When humans first reached Cyprus, they did not arrive as castaways driven ashore by accident, but as deliberate voyagers carrying intention across open water. Cyprus had never been connected to the mainland, even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, which meant arrival always required a crossing. This alone separates Cyprus from many other early settlement stories, because nothing about reaching it was inevitable. The sea was not a boundary that retreated, but an obstacle that had to be planned for, measured, and remembered. Early visitors understood that crossing meant commitment, because return was uncertain and resupply was impossible. They did not come lightly. Archaeological evidence shows that the first arrivals brought more than bodies and hunger. They brought tools shaped elsewhere, knowledge refined over generations, and skills designed to persist beyond a single landing. Stone tools appear immediately, not as improvised experiments, but as familiar forms adapted to new materials. Firemaker knowledge arrived with them, allowing heat, cooking, protection, and transformation of resources from the first moments of occupation. This indicates planning that extended beyond survival for a few days or weeks. Fire requires continuity, memory, and preparation, especially on an island where fuel sources are unfamiliar. The people who crossed to Cyprus expected to stay long enough for fire to matter. They also brought animals, intentionally or indirectly, altering the island's ecological balance almost immediately. Species that had evolved in isolation now encountered predators, competitors, and pressures they had never adapted to face. Cyprus was not an untouched paradise waiting to be discovered, but a closed system about to be reshaped. The earliest human presence coincides with the disappearance of endemic animals that had survived for millennia without human interference. These losses were not sudden massacres, but cumulative effects of hunting, habitat disruption, and ecological imbalance. Humans did not need to destroy deliberately in order to transform completely. Even careful presence carried consequences on an island with limited resilience. The tools brought across the sea accelerated these changes by increasing efficiency and reach. Cutting, scraping, and processing became easier, expanding what could be exploited and how quickly. Fire opened landscapes by clearing vegetation and altering plant succession. Paths formed, camps repeated, and familiar places emerged within an unfamiliar environment. Cyprus began to shift from an isolated ecosystem into a human-shaped landscape. This transition marks a crucial moment in human history, because it reflects confidence rather than desperation. These people were not merely surviving the sea crossing, but extending their way of life into a new space. Knowledge traveled with them, intact enough to function without immediate reinforcement from the mainland. Memory substituted for proximity, allowing techniques and traditions to survive separation. The crossing to Cyprus demonstrates that early seafaring was not experimental wandering, but practiced movement. Boats were not just vessels, but extensions of cultural systems capable of carrying knowledge forward. Arrival did not mark the end of the journey, but the beginning of adaptation. Tools were reshaped, strategies adjusted, and the island slowly absorbed into a wider human network. Cyprus became a testing ground for how humans could transplant themselves across water. What succeeded here would later be repeated elsewhere, across larger distances and harsher conditions. The island reveals that early seafaring was about continuity as much as courage. People crossed with expectations, not just hope. They arrived prepared to alter the land even if they did not yet understand the full consequences. Cyprus did not simply receive humans. It was transformed by what they carried with them. The story of early Cyprus begins not with arrival alone, but with everything that crossed the water alongside human bodies. Reaching Cyprus once was an achievement, but reaching it repeatedly required something far more demanding than courage. Because consistency across open water depends on systems rather than luck. The archaeological record suggests that Cyprus was not visited once and abandoned, but returned to again and again across generations. This pattern implies that early seafarers treated the sea not as a final barrier, but as a route that could be learned, remembered, and reused. Navigation across open water demanded more than sight of land. Because Cyprus disappears beyond the horizon long before a crossing is complete, travelers had to rely on wind, behavior, wave patterns, cloud formations, and the remembered direction of sunrise and sunset to maintain orientation. These skills were not improvised during a single voyage, but accumulated gradually through experience and shared knowledge. Boats capable of such crossings had to be constructed with balance, load, capacity, and seaworthiness in mind rather than speed alone. A vessel that could carry people but not cargo was insufficient for long-term settlement. Tools, fire-making materials, food reserves, and possibly animals all increased weight and risk during a crossing. The decision to transport them anyway reflects confidence that the destination justified the danger. Cargo transforms migration into colonization, because it signals intent to reproduce a way of life rather than simply survive arrival. Fire-making knowledge in particular required continuity. Since fire is not a single act but a process that must be sustained and renewed, carrying fire or the means to create it ensured control over heat, cooking, light, and protection from the first moments on the island. This control reduced dependence on immediate environmental luck and increased the margin for error during early occupation. Repeated crossings also imply return journeys, whether by the same individuals or by later groups following known routes. Knowledge of Cyprus's location, resources, and risks had to be preserved and transmitted across time. Memory substituted for maps, embedding geography within story, practice, and shared experience. Each successful crossing reinforced the reliability of the route and reduced its perceived uncertainty. The sea became less of an unknown and more of a space with rules that could be anticipated. This shift represents a cognitive transformation as much as a technological one. Humans began to treat water not as the end of habitable space, but as a medium through which space could be extended. Cyprus therefore became part of a wider human landscape rather than an isolated destination. This integration had ecological consequences that multiplied with every return. Each arrival brought new pressures on plants, animals, and landforms that had evolved without human disturbance. Even small populations exerted outsized influence on an island system with limited resilience. Hunting patterns altered animal behavior long before species disappeared entirely. Vegetation changed as fires cleared patches and encouraged new growth cycles unfamiliar to the island's past. Camps became anchors for repeated use, concentrating impact rather than dispersing it. Over time, these localized changes accumulated into systemic transformation. Cyprus did not experience a single moment of human arrival, but a gradual absorption into human routines. The sea crossing made this possible by allowing correction, reinforcement, and adaptation across generations. Failure could be learned from rather than ending the experiment entirely. Tools could be refined, routes adjusted, and strategies revised based on experience. This iterative process marks a departure from accidental dispersal toward intentional expansion. Humans were no longer merely encountering islands, but incorporating them into planned worlds. Cyprus became proof that cultural systems could survive separation from their place of origin. What crossed the sea was not just technology, but continuity. The island served as an early demonstration that humans could carry stable lifeways across unstable environments. This capacity would later enable far more ambitious crossings into the Pacific and beyond. Cyprus stands as one of the first places where the sea stopped being a limit and became infrastructure. The moment humans began crossing to Cyprus with cargo rather than only themselves, migration shifted into something far more consequential than movement. Tools carried across water were not conveniences, but extensions of entire lifeways developed elsewhere and transplanted intact. Stone blades, scrapers, and points appear immediately in the archaeological record, indicating familiarity rather than experimentation. These were not people learning how to live on an island from scratch. They were people arriving with expectations about how life should function. Fire-making knowledge amplified this transformation more than any single tool. Fire allowed cooking, protection, warmth, light, and landscape modification from the first days of occupation. It reduced dependence on raw chance by turning unfamiliar resources into usable ones. Fire also required planning, because it depends on fuel, memory, and continuity rather than isolated moments. The ability to sustain fire implies repeated occupation rather than brief visits. Camps were not abandoned lightly if fire mattered enough to maintain. With tools and fire, humans could process animals more efficiently, altering hunting pressure immediately. Even limited hunting on an island with no prior human predators carried outsized impact. Animals that had evolved without avoidance behaviors now faced sustained pressure they could not interpret or escape. This did not require overhunting to be effective. Consistency alone was enough. Cargo also made repetition possible, allowing camps to be reused rather than reinvented. Familiar places emerged where tools were sharpened, fires rebuilt, and paths retraced. These repeated actions concentrated impact into specific zones rather than dispersing it evenly. The landscape began to acquire human memory layered over ecological history. Carrying supplies also allowed early visitors to remain longer during each stay. Longer stays meant more interaction with the environment and more opportunity for unintended change. Vegetation responded to repeated clearing and burning, shifting plant composition over time. Open areas expanded where forests once regenerated uninterrupted. These openings attracted different animals, altering movement patterns and feeding behavior. Human presence reshaped food webs, indirectly as well as directly. Cargo therefore multiplied human influence without multiplying population. A small group equipped with tools and fire could exert pressure far beyond its numbers. This dynamic explains how early island ecosystems could be transformed without large settlements. Cyprus began changing not because humans overwhelmed it, but because they interacted with it consistently. The tools that crossed the sea carried assumptions about efficiency, control, and predictability. Those assumptions did not disappear upon arrival. Instead, they reshaped how people related to animals, plants, and space itself. What crossed the water was not just equipment, but intention. Humans were no longer visitors, testing an unfamiliar shore. They were occupants reproducing a way of life adapted elsewhere. Cargo anchored memory, allowing techniques to persist across time and distance. This persistence marked a turning point in island colonization. Cyprus became less an experiment and more a continuation. From that moment on, the island's future was inseparable from what humans chose to carry with them. Islands respond to pressure differently than continents, because their ecosystems evolved with fewer redundancies and narrower margins for error. Cyprus had developed in long isolation, with animal populations balanced carefully against limited space and predictable rhythms. When humans arrived repeatedly rather than briefly, those balances began to change even without deliberate intent. Hunting altered animal behavior first, long before it reduced animal numbers. Species that had never needed caution suddenly faced a new pattern of risk. This disruption spread unevenly, affecting some habitats more than others. Camps placed near water sources concentrated pressure where animals naturally gathered. Repeated use of the same locations amplified disturbance rather than dispersing it. Fire further accelerated these changes by reshaping vegetation around camps and travel routes. Burning cleared undergrowth, altered regeneration cycles, and favored certain plant species over others. These shifts created new open spaces that did not exist previously on the island. Open ground changed how animals moved, fed, and avoided danger. Some species benefited briefly from these changes, while others declined rapidly. The island's ecology began responding to human patterns rather than seasonal ones. This transformation did not happen everywhere at once. It accumulated slowly through repetition rather than through dramatic events. Each visit reinforced pathways, clearings, and hunting zones already established. Over time, these places became persistent features of the landscape. The island began to carry the imprint of human routines. Tools sharpened repeatedly at the same sites left debris that altered soil composition. Animal remains accumulated, attracting scavengers and shifting local food dynamics. Even waste became an ecological signal. These changes were subtle enough to escape notice in the moment. No single action appeared destructive on its own. Yet together, they exceeded the island's ability to return to its previous state. Cyprus could absorb disturbance, but not indefinitely. Once certain thresholds were crossed, recovery became incomplete rather than cyclical. Some species declined faster than reproduction could replace them. Others altered behavior in ways that reduced long-term viability. The island did not collapse suddenly, but it did begin to narrow its possibilities. Human presence became a constant variable rather than an occasional anomaly. Ecological systems adapted around that presence, even as they lost diversity. Cyprus entered a new phase defined by interaction rather than isolation. The land was no longer shaped only by climate, geology, and evolution. It was now shaped by memory, habit, and repeated decision-making. These decisions were not coordinated or planned at a large scale. They emerged from everyday actions carried out consistently over time. The island changed because people stayed, returned, and repeated what worked. What had once been a closed system became an open process, and with that shift, Cyprus moved quietly but permanently into a human-shaped world. The most significant changes on early Cyprus did not arrive through visible destruction, but through slow imbalance accumulating beyond recovery. Island species evolved under isolation, where survival depended on stability rather than adaptation to new threats. Human hunting did not need to be intense in order to be decisive. Regular and predictable pressure was enough to exceed reproductive limits over time. Some species declined quietly, leaving no dramatic evidence of collapse. Their absence became noticeable only after it had already become permanent. This pattern defines island extinctions more often than sudden catastrophe. Cyprus lost endemic animals not through massacre but through persistence. Human routines intersected repeatedly with animal life cycles in ways that could not be avoided. Breeding grounds were disrupted without intention. Movement paths were altered as camps and fires became fixed points on the landscape. Habitats shifted incrementally through repeated use rather than sudden clearing. Each of these changes alone was survivable for wildlife. Together, they narrowed the margin for recovery until it disappeared. The loss of one species triggered secondary effects throughout the ecosystem. Predators lost prey, and vegetation patterns shifted in response. Smaller animals and insects adjusted unevenly to altered plant communities. The island's ecology unraveled gradually, rather than collapsing outright. Humans may not have recognized these losses as they occurred. Change unfolded across generations rather than seasons. What felt normal to later inhabitants was already diminished from what had existed before. This created the illusion of continuity where none remained. By the time absence became visible, reversal was impossible. Islands rarely recover lost species without external intervention. Cyprus crossed that threshold early in its human history. From that point forward, ecological change became directional rather than cyclical. The island continued to function, but with fewer paths available to it. By the time human presence became continuous on Cyprus, the island had already crossed a threshold it could not retreat from. What began as arrival slowly became occupation through repetition rather than declaration. The island's ecosystems no longer operated independently of human activity. Hunting patterns, fire use, and settlement choices became embedded within ecological processes. Cyprus shifted from a closed system into a negotiated one. This transition did not require large populations or advanced technology. It required consistency over time. Once humans returned often enough, absence ceased to be part of the island's future. From that moment forward, every ecological process unfolded in relation to human behavior. The loss of endemic species could not be reversed because the conditions that supported them no longer existed. Even if pressure eased, habitats had already changed. Even if fires stopped, vegetation patterns had shifted permanently. Recovery no longer meant return, but adjustment. The island adapted around a new constant rather than restoring an old balance. This pattern would later repeat across islands throughout the world. Cyprus stands among the earliest examples of this transition. It shows that human impact did not begin with agriculture or cities. It began with movement paired with memory. Early seafaring carried habits and expectations as reliably as people themselves. Those habits proved stable enough to survive separation from their origins. They also reshaped places that had never encountered persistence before. Cyprus became proof that culture could travel intact across water. Boats functioned as extensions of social systems rather than simple transport. Knowledge replaced proximity as the glue holding lifeways together. This capacity marked a turning point in human history. Once lifeways could move reliably, no island was truly isolated anymore. Early Cyprus reminds us that history does not always turn on conquest, invention, or sudden collapse. Sometimes it turns on repetition, on returning again, carrying the same tools, rebuilding the same fires, and choosing continuity over retreat. In those ordinary decisions, islands changed, seas connected, and the human world quietly expanded beyond its old edge. If you value calm long-form stories that explore how the past unfolded slowly and irrevocably, subscribe to Terra Stories, where history is given the time it deserves.